So this book now is taking all these areas of space, time, and so biology. We were talking off camera, we're going to biology next.
Yeah, I think, part of it too, our students need to know that this is probably where they're going to be assaulted first. I mean, not everyone has got enough expertise in the university system to be able to attack the reliability of our scripture. Some will, some won't.
Right.
But everyone's got, you're going to have physics, you're going to be in philosophy classes, you're going to be in the hard science classes, and these are places where we're going to have to deal with the objections to our worldview. And one of these is going to be in the hard sciences. I have a son who's in his third years in rotations right now in med school, so his undergraduate work was in biochemistry. And I can tell you that he was in these hard science classes. And one of the things that kept him motivated as a theist was knowing what is the truth about what it is that explains the origin of life, for example. It used to be that people would assume that there's some underlying principle of physics that has created life in our universe from non-life. But it turns out there are a number of conundrums. The most basic building blocks of organic life are proteins. And these are assembled from amino acids. The question is, how do we get amino acids? And then how do we get the amino acids to come together in the form of proteins? And then how do we get the proteins to assemble into the building blocks of life, the little molecular machines that are built like Legos from 20, 40, 60 pieces of proteins that come together in a certain shape? How do we get that to happen? And they've looked at this for years and years, trying to figure out, well, where could it happen? Did it happen in the atmosphere? Did it happen in the water, on the land? Did it happen under the tectonic plates? Did it happen in space? There are no good answers to that question because there are certain conundrums. Chicken and egg problems. It turns out you need proteins to have life, but proteins are formed in something in the cell that's called a ribosome. The problem, of course, is the ribosome is built by what? Proteins. So you have to have the protein-built machine to build proteins. This happens over and over and over again at the molecular level. But worse yet, it turns out all of this is driven by information in DNA, and genetic information. And that's the problem we have. Is that it turns out that what is underlying all of this is not physics, it's information. Because physics can't even get you the information we see in the genetic code.
Right.
There's no law of physics that demands that the nucleotides in DNA form in a certain way to produce the outcome they produce. They are information, like letters in a sentence. And because of the way they are, your genetic information is different than my genetic. And as a detective, I'm always looking at crime scenes, right? To see, well, whose genetic information is there. It tells me a lot about what I'm looking for. So the question then becomes, what is the source of genetic information? And here's the biggest takeaway from a gentleman named Stephen C. Meyer, who's a great thinker. He's got his PhD in philosophy of science. This is a guy who's, I think, made a good contribution. Here's what he's noted. We have no example anywhere in the history of the universe, in the history of science, in which we can show that information comes from anything other than an intelligent source.
Right.
There's no demonstration of how physics can provide complex, specific information. But we do know that intelligent sources provide complex information. If DNA is the kind of high-level, complex, specific information which we know it is, the question is, how do we get that? Who is the author? What is the author of that information that is really going to be the author of life? Well, who is that? What is that? Could it be something other than a personal, intelligent force? Could an impersonal force of physics get you that? No. So at the very root, my son knew at the very root of his investigation of life as a doctor, that you can't get your feet off the ground. You can't take the first step in explaining life without relying on something you cannot get from inside the room. You have to go outside the room for an overarching, transcendent source of this information before you can even begin with life.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the things that our students need to know that. And it turns out, let me just say this, when you walk into a death scene, your presuppositions will determine how you interpret evidence.
Yes, totally.
Period. If I walk into that scene and I'm convinced that a husband did this, I had a scene like that once where they were convinced the husband did it. Well, there was no husband to be found. We spent a week looking for a husband or a boyfriend. She didn't have a husband or a boyfriend. Turned out it was a neighbor totally unrelated to her who did the murder. Well, why did we stick on that for that long? Because we started off with that as a presupposition. Remember, science doesn't tell you anything. Scientists do. Evidence doesn't say anything.
That's
Jurors
a great point.
do.
Like you can go, even the crime scene thing, you got people who more than one person could have threatened them, you could have 10 different DNAs in the room.
Right.
You could have access to an entire crowd. It was a party. They're all in the room.
Right.
You can pick a person and build a case against
Well,
them.
this is the thing that comes into it. In the end, if I walk into this scene of the universe, but I'm committed, before I begin, to rejecting anything supernatural.
Yep.
If I'm a committed philosophical naturalist, well, then I'm going to encounter DNA information. I'm going to go, okay, well, it can't be anything intelligent. It has to be something that is an impersonal law of physics. I'm going to spend my entire life trying to explain that information from the perspective I brought in the room with me.
Right.
So
It's
again,
exactly right.
I'm not allowing the science to say anything. I, as the scientist, am trying to tell you what this says.
See, I'm kind of a guy, I always try to think in analogies and stories. If I was to appear in a foreign country in a big mountain and there's copper and all kinds of metals and stuff in there and there's rocks laying around, I don't know if I'm the first guy there or not. But if I see a stack of pennies, neatly all piled up in 4 rows, from different years in 1980, 1990. I mean, that's pretty good proof that somebody was there before me, took the copper, made pennies from it, stamped dates on it,
That's right.
piled them in little neat rows
Yeah.
up and down. I'm going, I'd be crazy.
Right.
To think this is natural. I think the mountain just made the copper and stamped 1986 on the penny, piled them up in neat rows of 10s. That's what it would be like
That's right.
to be an atheist and looking at the evidence you're looking at and going, what's wrong with you to think this all just happened?
Right, it's because I've got a prior commitment. So here's what I try to do in the book. I try to take each chapter and start with a crime scene that I've really worked. And we have a certain skill set you're going to gain out of that crime scene.
So we're learning.
Right, and then we're going to turn a corner and show you how we can apply that skill set to this one particular piece of evidence in the universe. So we're going to start with just regular crime scenes in each chapter, and then we're going to move those into the universe to try to apply that skill set. 'Cause I think you're right. Analogies are helpful. That analogy of the stack of coins really kind of illustrates the problem. It's kind of like saying, hey, we know that the wind and the rain can create, the Grand Canyon, can create things perhaps, but we don't think it can create Mount Rushmore. There's something about the side of Mount Rushmore that we say as attributes of
Intelligent
design.
design.
So it's reasonable. It's a reasonable inference. And that's what we're trying to do here. Do we have good evidence in the universe? Can we explain that with our presuppositions as a naturalist? Can atheism even explain that stuff? Or do they really have to kind of borrow from our Christian worldview, our theistic worldview?
They do.
In order to make the case at all. That's why I say I think that the fact we can argue does that. I think the fact that we have biological evidence is best explained by an outside inference. So again, this is just the burden we all have. It's not just on us as Christians to make a case for God's existence. It's really not about this thing out there yet. It's about how do we explain these 8 things in here.
Yeah.
In the crime scene, every detective who stands around that crime scene in that yellow tape area has to offer an explanation for what he sees in that room. And if we disagree, make your case. That's all we're doing here. It turns out I want Christians to realize that we have a good case.
Yes.
And we can make an excellent case. But here's the thing, Leon. Most of us are too, I'm going to say it, we're too lazy to do it.
Okay, I was going to bring that up. I think, and I've spoken, I've interviewed different people like you who have just gone through the evidence, and you are so convinced, and you see it so simply. This is just how, but you'll talk to people, and unless we dumb it down so much they can get it in a 30-second bite, they don't care.
Well, let me offer you a 10-second incentive.
Okay.
Most of us who are listening to this have got children.
Yes.
And if you need an incentive, look at your junior hires.
Yeah.
Look at your college-age students. If you would do anything for those kids, as a matter of fact, if they were struggling in math, you get them a tutor. You spend time with them after school every day, helping them with their math. You take them to volleyball tournaments all over the country so they can get a volleyball scholarship. If there's some other area of their life that you think is deficient, and you have a high enough value for that thing, you will do whatever it takes. Read whatever. You'll become the best soccer coach you can be to coach your kid's team. Well, here we have one area that we think the church is involved in. That's the church's responsibility. Right. Pastors do that. No, we do that as parents. If we're willing to help tutor our kids in math and get them on that car ride to that volleyball tournament, then we ought to be willing to take the time to be able to make the case for our students. If you don't think you need to make it for yourself, at least make it for your kids. Because there's going to come a time when they're going to ask you, and you're going to need to know how to answer these questions. Yeah.
We need to do this because you're right. We are losing our kids, our families at an alarming rate. And then there are those that are really growing. It's not all bad news. There is a huge revival taking place around the world, but it's where we're dealing with real issues and
Real
not
doubt.
just being religious.
Yeah, that's so true.
So, man, our time is up, but thank you for being with us today. This
Appreciate
was
it.
awesome.
Thanks,
I want to encourage everyone to get a hold of this book. Hey, it'll teach you how to be a detective, and you can use it for your worldview. It says God's Crime Scene. It's a cold case detective examining the evidence for a divinely created universe.